Hello and welcome. You're watching the Red Vitus channel, and I'm here again today with another watch repair video. I'll be working on this Elgin wristwatch, which is non-running. So I'll take a look at it, see if I can figure out what's wrong. Shaking it doesn't start the watch, so I'll try and see if I can set the hands. Well, that shouldn't happen. Next, I'll remove the case back and take a look at the movement. Now I see the movement inside of a case ring and fit it into the back of the case. Next, I'll remove the movement from the case. And it should come out by gravity. Sometimes they're a little bit tough, but this one came out no problem. And I use a hand puller, a Presto tool, to remove the hands. Makes the job very easy. And I'll set those aside. Now there's two screws holding the movement to the case ring, which I'll remove. Lift off the dial. I had to pry it a little bit. And it's attached to the movement with two screws on the sides. And I'll put it away safely while I work on the movement. And I'm beginning disassembly now. That was the hour wheel. I see a lot of the common problems with with both pocket watches and wristwatches. There's rust on the dial side. Wristwatches take quite a bit of abuse when you think about how a wristwatch is worn. It's exposed to heat, sunlight, sometimes rain, sweat, compared to a pocket watch, which would, normally be held in a vest pocket or maybe a pant pocket. These wristwatches can have a good bit of rust, especially at the setting works. Now this watch is an Elgin, and it says on the dial that it's a Shockmaster, and it has a little symbol, which I'll talk about in a minute. The Shockmaster, I believe that refers to the shock protection on the balance. So there's a set of jewels and a spring, which allows the watch to absorb a shock without damaging the balance staff. We're getting a brief look at that from the top. We'll see it again later. But that was an innovation for wristwatches, so that as your arm, bumps into doors, the watch is going to receive a little bit of a jolt, and that takes away the energy from the balance and prevents damage. Now the other symbol on the dial stands for Dura Power, which refers to actually to the mainspring in this watch. That was an Elgin logo or trademark, indicating that it no longer had the old-fashioned blued steel mainsprings. Rather, it would have I guess they would have called it a long-lasting, maybe even a lifetime mainspring, which are less prone to break. And they also, I think they deliver a more consistent power over their lifetime. Now there's the balance, and now I remove that balance and balance cock as one piece. So I had to do that because of the way that the regular pins are assembled in this watch. They hold on to the hairspring, and I had to remove it all as one piece. Moving on with the rest of the disassembly, this is the train bridge. And although I did see a good bit of rust on the dial side, the back of this movement really looks pretty clean, or at least has avoided a lot of the problems on the dial side. It still needs a good cleaning, but not too bad. The finish on this movement looks to be a little problematic. I hope that cleans up and brightens up in the watch cleaner, but we'll see. And that's the screw for the barrel. That screw attaches actually to the arbor. Now I'm lifting up the ratchet wheel and taking that off. This is the screw for the crown wheel, which is a left-handed screw. And they're often not indicated, but they're usually, not always, but usually left-handed screws. This is a second bridge for the train wheels. It holds down the center wheel, which is not jeweled. This is a 17 jewel movement, but the extra 2 jewels are on the escape wheel. They are cap jewels. And we just got a glimpse of the escape wheel. Here I'm removing the barrel bridge, and I'm leaving the click assembly on, but I will remove that later and clean the spring and click independently of that bridge. Now I'm taking away the escape wheel. And this is the pallet cock. Now the shape of this pallet cock kind of mirrors the shape of the pallet fork. So although it's a simple design, I think it's effective. We want to be super careful with this part. The escape wheel, very delicate. It has jewels which are easily chipped and pivots that are quite small. But it comes off no problem. I'm looking at the case, which needs a good cleaning, and I'd always intended on replacing this crystal. It's scratched pretty badly, and I can tell from the shape of it that it's been refinished before. It also pops out with less effort than it should take, so I'll have to figure out what's the matter, and I'll clean the case while I do that. Now here's the old crystal, and as I examine it, what I notice is a little peculiar. Looking around the inside of the crystal, there's a groove which runs all the way around. I'm just going to point that out. So I think you can see the groove on the bottom. This is looking from the bottom of the crystal. And so what is the purpose of that groove? Well, to show you that, I'm going to take another crystal out of the package that I have in my stash. And now this is an armor or tension ring crystal. It's a little bit larger than the old crystal, but otherwise it looks similar. The difference is on the bottom, there's a metal ring. Now these rings can be either white or yellow. In this case, it's a white ring. And the ring comes out. Now that ring is polished on the top and plain on the bottom. And that tension ring imparts stiffness to the crystal when it's installed in the watch. Now looking closely at this crystal, I also notice that there's a groove running around the inside, just like the original crystal. And so I know that original crystal was likely a tension ring crystal, but for some reason it didn't have its ring. And taking some measurements of the watch, what I was able to understand is that this crystal was actually a little bit too large for the watch, and so I believe the tension ring was left out so that it would fit. So what I'm going to do is measure and get a correct size, and it turns out I needed a 28.3 millimeter crystal. Now I'm going to use this crystal press to install that tension ring crystal. This is a BB press. And it comes with, or at least I have, a set of dies that go along with that press in 3 boxes. And I'll just stack them in front here. Now these boxes contain all the dies for the tops and bottoms of this press for different configurations. This first box has flat and tapered dies. The second box has straight-sided dies. And the third box has some soft domed dies and some odd-shaped tapered dies. So I believe this is a full set that goes with this press. Now the box I'll be using for tension ring is this first one, and I need to select a flat plate die to fit and support underneath the case, and a tapered die to mate properly with the crystal so that it compresses and is pushed into the case. I think you can see the number on this box, BB504. So with this press, really makes this job easy. There are other presses which I'm sure work fine, but I've always had good results with this BB press, so that's what I'll use. So next, I'll pick out the dies that I need. Now first, the lower die. So I'll use this largest of the flat plates, and that goes on the bottom. And I'll select a tapered die next. Now they're two-sided, and I'm using the larger of the two sides on this die. It snaps in. Now here's the watch case, cleaned up and strapped. And I place the new tension ring crystal slowly centering the die around the edges of the crystal, and it snaps in. It's that quick. Much improved, and it's not going to press out really with any amount of finger pressure. I will be reusing the mainspring that came with the watch. Here I'm looking for the appropriate size winder. Now that I have it wound, I'll add the arbor. And with the arbor installed, I'll next lubricate the bearing surfaces. I've already lubricated the mainspring. This oil that I'm using is HP 1300. I use 8200 for the mainspring. And now it's ready. And all the parts are clean, and it's time to begin reassembly. And while I lubricate some parts, I'll say a little bit about the movement. It has Elgin 629 on the train bridge. However, this movement was not made by Elgin. It's actually a Swiss movement, an FHF 28. This was something that the Elgin company was using, I think, towards the 40s and into the 50s and early 60s until they went out of business, was to use Swiss-made movements. Even though Elgin was perfectly capable of producing its own movements, it had made tens of millions of them over its existence. It just found that by the 50s, the Swiss movements were of good quality and actually cheaper than Elgin could make itself at its own factory. So it began importing these movements, and today these watches are known as Swiss Elgins. There are some Elgin watches, I think even in this period, that were entirely made by Elgin. So there was the model 730, 750, 732, which were all Elgin-made movements. Elgin even made an automatic movement, which I believe was one of the very few ever produced in the United States. That was the Elgin 760 and 761, 27 and 30 jouled self-winding movements. But those, unfortunately, were short-lived, and the Elgin factory went out of business in the late 60s. The Elgin name went on and changed hands, and watches are still being produced today with the Elgin name, although I don't think there's that much in common with those movements and the ones that were produced in the original National Watch Company Elgin factory. Continuing with the assembly, I'm oiling the post for the click. If you've watched my videos in the past, you'll know that I don't show all of the oiling steps. I do show quite a few. In this video, however, I'm going to show some of the oiling steps in a bit more detail, mainly because this movement has a couple different types of cap jewels. There's the shock setting for the balance, and there's a cap jewel in a setting for the escape wheel. And I'm going to show both of those in a bit of detail later on. And for now, I'll continue screwing in the click and securing it. This is the center wheel, and I'm oiling the pivot or the arbor. It's hollow in this movement, and it also is not jeweled. Making it a little bit tougher to install, but not too bad. And I pre-oil the arbor on the other side, or the pivot on the other side again, with a heavier oil, before installing the lower train bridge. This watch has two train bridges, and the reason for that lies in the presence of a center second wheel. By this time in the 50s, center seconds wheels were the way things were going in the watch industry. The sub-second wheel was kind of going out of favor. And in order to place a second wheel in the center, it required some redesign of the movements. And in this case, they used two bridges. And that was to accommodate that center pivot, which extends through the center wheel and then serves as the post for the second hand. that has the effect of making the watch movement thicker, which really wasn't too big of a deal for this watch, which has no complications. But the movement is quite thick, and if this had a self-winding mechanism, it would be quite thick for a small watch. There are other ways of achieving this without having two bridges. One way I've seen was with a center pivot instead of a wheel, and that'll use a spring to hold that pinion in place. Another way I've seen is to have the cannon pinion still, but it'll be offset from center, which also allows that center or that seconds hand to be located in the center. I think in that case the movements are a little larger in diameter. I'm not sure if they have to be, but the ones that I've worked on were like that. And I think that really reflects what was a pretty incredible age of watch design and ingenuity, keeping up with changing market demands, wanting smaller watches, new features, and all in an era before computer-aided design. Now I'm putting together the setting works. This is the winding and sliding pinion, and I've applied a grease because this is a rather high friction part of the watch. And I'll place this part onto the pillar plate. The winding and setting components in this watch are pretty typical of Swiss-made watches. They'll all show a very similar component design. This, of course, is the stem. The grease I'm using here is KT22. I'm applying grease to the square side and to this notch, separating the threaded part from the squared part. I also place some grease on the end of that stem. All these parts are fairly high friction areas, and I probably greased them a little bit heavier than they needed. I do tend to see more rust in these areas, and hopefully that grease will prevent that. Now with the screwdriver, I'm tightening this detent screw, which brings the setting lever onto the plate and holds the stem into the movement. Placing HP 1300 on some of the posts for the winding and setting gears. That's the minute wheel post. And that is the post for the clutch lever. This is some grease that I'm applying on the setting lever. That's where it contacts the clutch lever, sometimes called a yoke. So this is the clutch lever. This is the cannon pinion. And the minute wheel. The clutch lever spring is a lot beefier than the click spring, so I'll use 2 hands. This is the set lever spring. And it has 2 screws. And what you'll see me do is I'll partially tighten them and then position the set lever spring in place. And that leaves a little bit of freedom for when I do that. And once the spring is in place, I'll tighten the screws all the way down. Now I'm setting the spring over the post in the set lever and doing the final tightening of the 2 screws. Here I'm testing the action in the setting mode, and everything looks fine. Now the winding mode. Back to the other side, and I'll install the crown wheel. The crown wheel has a left-handed screw. This first piece that I'm putting in is a bushing. And the crown wheel. Next, I assemble the components of the upper train bridge. This is the third wheel. I had a little bit of trouble setting that one in place. The jewel is hidden below the train bridge. Now the fourth wheel, which is the post for the second stand, and I've already oiled the jewel, but I'm placing a little bit of oil on this nub near the bottom of the pivot. And last, the escape wheel. It fits underneath the other 2 wheels. This wheel could be installed first, but I did it in this order to avoid knocking that smaller escape wheel out of place. Now with the train bridge on, I just check to see that all the wheels are freely moving. This is a step that can cause problems if not all the pivots are in their jewel holes. It's easy to break a pivot or a jewel if this is done incorrectly. So I just take my time. Now everything looks good. and I can fasten the upper train bridge. And I test the wheels one more time before final tightening. I'm now removing the upper jewel for the escape wheel. This is a cap jewel in a setting, and it has a tiny screw which has to be removed. Now, using a small piece of Rodico, I lift the jewel out of the plate and I set it on this movement holder. Even though this has already been through the cleaner, I still like to peg these jewels. I always find a little bit of residue even after cleaning, and the peg wood really takes the rest of it off. Then I drop the jewel into a solvent. That just removes any remaining residue. This is lighter fluid, by the way. And after a quick rinse, I take the jewel out and dry it over tissue paper. One could use watch paper. I just find that this tissue paper is a little bit easier to come by, and it doesn't leave it doesn't have any loose fibers that get left on the parts. So that lighter fluid dries quickly and doesn't leave a residue. Now I place a drop of light oil right in the center of the jewel. And return the setting back to the movement. This movement holder I'm using is kind of convenient. Serves as both a holder and a table. I also have the Bergeron movement holder, which I also like. I think it's a very nicely made movement. I just decided to use this movement holder on this particular caliber because at 10.5 lines, it just fit the movement perfectly. And I also think because it's a little bit wider than most movement holders, it gives it some added stability. Now I screw that setting back on, and that's complete. Now I have to apologize, I did not get a good shot of the installation of the pallet fork. My head got in the way, so I am showing the pallet bridge. And it's attached with one screw. So I'm checking first that the pivot is in the jewel before tightening. And as I'm tightening, I usually stop and just make sure that the pallet fork moves freely along the way. Now I have the pallet fork all the way in, and what I'm doing here is I'm gently putting pressure on that center wheel, and what that should do is fling the pallet fork to one or the other of the posts, and that just indicates that the pallet fork is installed properly. Now it's time for the balance. I really like these shock settings. I think actually in these watch movements, the balance is really easier to install than it is in pocket watches. The reason for that is I can remove the jewels, and that gives me a bigger target to install the balance wheel and ensure that the pivot is aligned properly. I see some motion there. It dies down quickly, but that tells me that everything is good. It should spin freely once the balance bridge is fully screwed in and the jewels are in place. These are the 2 jewels for that shock setting. Again, I have a cap jewel and a hole jewel, and I'm placing a drop of oil onto the cap jewel. And then I set the hole jewel, which is pressed into a chaton on top of that cap jewel, and that drop of oil holds it together. Now before I install the jewel, I will screw down the balance bridge. Okay, now we have some better motion. The jewel's in place. And the last part is the spring for the shock setting. This one has a kind of a cloverleaf shaped spring. There's an easy way to install it. You make a wrench, or I made a wrench out of a piece of pegwood. What I've done is I've tapered the end and then hollowed out the center. And that just slides that spring into the correct position. And now it's ticking nicely. Well, we have a working movement. I'm just going to install the dial screws. Might be more advisable to do this at the beginning, but I waited till the end. And I'm going to screw this all the way in and then back it out just a few turns to give clearance for the dial feet. I'll then repeat this for the other screw off camera. One of the last components I install is the hour wheel, which is the post for the hour hand. And as always, I add a dial washer, even if one wasn't there to begin with. Now I can replace the dial back onto the movement and install the movement ring. With these wristwatch movements, at least with this one, the hands needed to be installed before casing, which I did off camera. But with the watch cased, I'm going to place it in the timer and see how it runs. So before I timed this watch, I let it run a couple days. Then I gave it a complete winding and then let it run down for about 12 hours. And we see it has good amplitude with the correct lift angle of 52 degrees. And it's keeping pretty good time. Certainly not chronometer grade, but I think this one should keep reasonably good time on the wrist. And there you have it. This is a completed watch. Let's take our final look at it. It's a really good feeling to bring this watch to life. From non-working order, incorrect crystal without a tension ring, now to a nicely polished watch and a new crystal. Now the dial is a bit worn down. There are replacement dials that can be purchased, but I elected not to do that. You always run into the dilemma, I think, when you have a new dial, if the case also isn't similarly new. So in this case, I think the wear on the case matches what's on the dial. And, you know, this is a 60-plus-year-old watch. And even with that, I think it looks nice. It still runs great. And I think it's ready to be worn. Well, we're at the end of this video. I'd just like to thank everyone for tuning in. This is Red Vitus, and I hope to see you again.